This is not just a powerful man whose family has grifted off him. He is the ringleader of the grift. He's been doing this since his earliest days in that peculiar state of Delaware. He's been influence peddling and using his family while he posed all his life as Modest Joe, the poorest man in Congress.
Welcome to another episode of the Carol and Glick Show. It's been a while since I've done an interview, so I wanted to make sure that my first one after a couple of weeks of not interviewing anybody would be somebody that you'd really want to hear from. And so I asked Miranda Devine from the New York Post if she would be my guest, and I was thrilled that she said yes. For those of you who don't know, Miranda Devine is the star columnist from the New York Post who broke the Hunter Biden laptop story on the eve of the 2020 elections. And she later wrote a book about the laptop called Laptop from Hell, Hunter Biden, Big Tech, and the Dirty Secrets the President Tried to Hide, that came out at the end of 2021. Miranda Devine and I have been following together, sort of reporting simultaneously another story that's related to the laptop, which is about an old colleague of mine, Gal Luft, who is an expert in alternative energy sources, non-carbon, non-fossil fuels, and he has been indicted on a number of charges now on the lam, and he's given a couple of interviews as well to Miranda about what happened. He was also giving information about the contents of Hunter Biden's laptop. Anyway, if you guys don't know what in the hell I'm talking about, don't worry. That's why we have Miranda Devine here. So first of all, I just want to thank you, Miranda, for joining me today and welcome you to the Carol and Glick Show. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks very much, Caroline. I very much enjoy reading you from afar, so it's a great honor to be with you.
Oh, well, it's a great honor for you to tell me that it's a great honor. So anyway, so I want to get into a discussion about all of the things that you've really been the most prominent reporter regarding, which is all of the incredible corruption that Hunter Biden's laptop exposes in terms of the Biden family and how they do influence peddling, not only with people in the United States, but most importantly with foreign governments, particularly with governments that aren't friendly to the United States, first and foremost China, but others as well. So before I start with the laptop and Hunter Biden's conviction this past week for by lying on a federal declaration that he wasn't using drugs when he bought a firearm a few years ago. Can you tell me a little bit about Alexander Smirnov? Because that's another issue that's related to the Biden administration or the Biden family and their dealings with a Ukrainian oil company called Burisma. And I want to use Alexander Smirnov to get into the issue of Burisma and maybe a little bit into Ukraine and then move on from there.
Well, Alexander Smirnov is in jail at the moment in California, accused of lying to the FBI and portrayed as a Russian spy. Now, he was a long-term, highly paid FBI confidential human source, they call them, an informant, very well trusted. And he gave some information to his FBI handler back in, it would have been like 2019, 2020, about some of his Ukrainian contacts. And he, by the way, Smirnov is an Israeli-American citizen. He was born in Soviet Russia, moved to Israel at the age of 11, and then went to the United States at the age of 25. He had these Ukrainian contacts, and they included the executives of this energy company, Burisma, which ended up paying Hunter Biden, the then Vice President Joe Biden's son, $1 million a year to sit on its board. at a time that Burisma was under investigation by the Ukrainian prosecutor general for corruption. So Smirnov met
and also by the
with
British, and also they were also under investigation by Britain, right? By the Britain anti-fraud.
That's right, the British Serious Fraud Office. So after the Maidan Revolution, when Poroshenko became the Ukrainian president of basically a puppet US government, the world, the West, was very keen on clawing back billions of dollars that had been stolen by the previous Soviet-aligned Yanukovych government. And so the big kind of sort of beautiful case that they presented in London at this big kleptocracy conference that Theresa May presided over was that they'd frozen $23 million in the bank account of the owner of $23 million in the bank account of the owner of Burisma, a guy called Nikolai Zlochevsky. And he, of course, was Hunter Biden's boss because he hired Hunter to come and sit on his board for $1 million a year, basically to be protection, because he knew that he was under investigation by the Ukrainians. And ironically, Vice President Biden at the time was threatening Ukraine and flying over there all the time and giving these rousing speeches about how you have to crack down on corruption, and corruption is corrosive and destroys a country, while his own son was getting paid $83,000 a month. Anyway, so Smirnov just finds himself in the center of this, and in a sort of a throwaway comment to his FBI handler, he mentioned that these Ukrainians, which included Zlochevsky, the owner of Burisma, had told him that he'd had to pay a bribe to both Joe Biden and Hunter Biden of $5 million apiece. And it was a throwaway line, and his FBI handler, because it wasn't sort of relevant to...
But he was talking to them. He was talking to them about something else. First of all, let me just make this a little bit clearer. So first of all, Hunter Biden was making $1 million a year from a Ukrainian oil and an energy company, Burisma. He has no background in anything related to oil or gas. He's a crackhead. And he is sitting on their board making $1 million a year, $83,000 a month, while this energy firm is under investigation in Ukraine and in Britain for fraud, for corruption. And at that time that they're under investigation is when the owner of Burisma hired Hunter Biden to sit on his board, and Hunter Biden's father, the Vice President of the United States, is in charge of U.S. policy vis-a-vis Ukraine. And if I remember correctly, just to get a little, to circle the square, Trump, when he was president, his first impeachment was about the same firm, Burisma. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention about Smirnov is, just to be clear, he was an FBI informant. He informed that he was a credible guy. He worked for the FBI. He gave them information about lots of different things that they were worried about that helped the United States of America. And in the course of giving them a briefing about something, he made an offhanded comment about Burisma. And it's that offhanded comment that he made, this trusted, long-standing FBI informant who received money from the U.S. government because he was helping America. He got arrested, and it was something that he said in relation to the Bidens and Burisma. Is that correct?
Yes, but you've left out a little step in there, which is he made this offhand remark. His handler didn't, just mention it in passing in the report that he put into the files. They were really interested in, it was a kleptocracy investigation, and Burisma was part of that. And then some years later, in 2020, there were, Donald Trump was president, and there were all these allegations flooding into various Department of Justice offices around the country, in Arkansas, in Los Angeles, in New York, in Washington, that were derogatory about Joe Biden, basically talking about Joe Biden's corruption in not just in Ukraine, but elsewhere, including China. And so Bill Barr, who was then the Attorney General, decided to put a trusted US attorney called Scott Brady in charge of vetting all this information. And a lot of it came from Rudy Giuliani, who was the former mayor of New York, but acting at that time as Donald Trump's personal attorney, the president's personal attorney. And he was particularly exercised about the impeachment you just mentioned, because Donald Trump was being impeached for asking President Zelensky in a telephone call to investigate these corruption allegations about Joe and Hunter Biden in Ukraine. And he was impeached in the end for that, but he was impeached for crimes that Joe Biden, or corruption that Joe Biden was guilty of. And it was the impeachment itself, I believe, was a grand cover-up. So Scott Brady is assigned by Bill Barr to vet all the information coming from Giuliani and elsewhere, and just to make sure that it is valid and not Russian disinformation, and, just do some basic due diligence on it before his task was to hand it over to this secret investigation going on in the Biden's home state of Delaware. Now, that investigation was into Hunter Biden and his allegations of financial crime. That was tax fraud, money laundering, foreign agent violations, sex trafficking, wire fraud, you name it. It was a pretty voluminous 5-year investigation, which I'll get back to later.
It was handled by a man named David Weiss, is that correct?
That's right. He was the U.S. attorney for Delaware, and he'd been in Delaware his entire career. And Delaware, your listeners should understand, is a very peculiar, very small state. Most corporations in America are headquartered there. So there's a lot of money and power sloshing around there, but it not in the hands of the ordinary people, just in basically the Bidens. Joe Biden, his family ruled the roost for 50 years in Delaware since he first became a senator, and a very powerful senator. He was the chairman for many years of the Foreign Relations Committee, sometimes for the Judiciary Committee, or he was the ranking member. He had immense power, and the corporations there's a credit card company called MDNA that is very wealthy. They lavished Joe Biden with money. He had many donors. He was always awash with cash, thanks to this peculiar position he had of power in this small, insignificant state, other than it's called America's Liechtenstein, because it has such obscure, opaque company laws that's why everyone wants to headquarter there. Anyway, so back to Smirnov. Smirnov is this very, very, very trusted FBI source. He makes this throwaway remark about the Bidens. Scott Brady is doing some due diligence, and he gets his people to search the FBI database. And lo and behold, this old report from poor old Smirnov flags a red flag to them, because it mentions both the Bidens and Burisma. So his handler, Smirnov's handler, is told, go out and interview Smirnov and find out more. So Smirnov dutifully tells his handler what he never told him a couple of years earlier, and more detail about the Bidens. And he said that Zlochevsky had told him that he'd paid $10 million in bribes to the Bidens to help him out with Burisma and the problems that they were facing. And that also that for his own safekeeping, he had many tapes, like at least a dozen recordings, audio recordings of both Joe Biden and Hunter Biden, and that was his insurance policy. So Scott Brady did a bit more due diligence on Smirnov and didn't know who he was, because the FBI kept that very private. But a lot of what Smirnov had told his handler, they checked out through other sources, and he decided it was legitimate enough to pass on to this Delaware investigation run by U.S. Attorney David Weiss. And this is where it gets peculiar, because David Weiss received that information. He, first of all, was very reluctant to receive it. And in fact, Scott Brady had to go over his head back to the Department of Justice and demand that U.S. Attorney David Weiss in Delaware accept the information and a briefing. Finally, he did, but he buried it. He never showed it to any of his investigators. He just tucked it in a drawer and forgot about it. These bombshell allegations, which were directly relevant to the investigation into Hunter Biden. So, meanwhile, David Weiss is slow-walking this investigation and allowing it to be obstructed by his prosecutors and also the Department of Justice, and also, interestingly, we've only just found this out, by the CIA. According to testimony from two of those investigators who turned into whistleblowers, they were from the IRS, they were running the investigation. They went to Congress and said that this investigation has been slow-walked and obstructed. And they testified that the CIA had informed the prosecutors that they could not or should not, or warned them off, interviewing a crucial witness. And that witness was a Hollywood attorney by the name of Kevin Morris, who had come to the rescue of Hunter Biden in 2020 when his father was running for the presidency. And Hunter Biden at that stage, his life was a mess. He was a crack addict, had been a crack addict. He wasn't at that point, but he had all these debts. He had all these tax debts, millions of dollars. He had a new wife, but he had an old wife, ex-wife, that he wasn't paying alimony to. And there were liens over her properties because of the tax debts. She couldn't get a passport. She was threatening to go to court. He also had another scandal. He had a woman, a stripper from Washington, D.C., who he got pregnant and then refused to admit it was his child. And then she had to go to court to get a DNA test with a paternity suit and prove that it was his child. And so he was being sued for child support there. So he had all these problems that were threatening to blow up and damage Joe Biden's presidential campaign. So in comes this knight in shining armor, this attorney who Hunter didn't know, but introduced himself to Hunter and said, "I'll make all your problems go away." He lent him, we know of $6.5 million, which he's admitted to in testimony, but it looks to be, could be as much as $10 million. He's paid off all his tax debts, something like $3.5 million there. He's funded his lavish lifestyle. Hunter and his new wife were living in, $25,000 a month rentals around Malibu and Venice Beach. And Hunter, of course, doesn't have a job. Hunter has become sort of a painter, an artist, and turns out that most of those paintings, which were selling, for $100,000, we were told up to $500,000 each for a first-time painter. It was a pretty good gig. And Kevin Morris, this Hollywood attorney, this knight in shining armor, was buying most of these paintings. So that was all very curious. And then we find out that the CIA has warned off the investigators from interviewing Kevin Morris. So we don't really know yet why that is. I think that the Republicans in the House are trying to find out, but they'll probably never find out whether or not Kevin Morris was already a sort of an asset or an informant for the CIA in Hollywood, or whether he's just being protected because the Bidens are being protected. And I've just finished writing a book, a sequel to Laptop from Hell, which is about the cover-up. And the shadowy hand of the CIA is everywhere, protecting Joe Biden very early on, but then protecting Hunter Biden in all his adventures in Ukraine, China, Romania, Kazakhstan, all these shady countries where he was earning millions of dollars while being a crackhead.
Wait, so before we get into, trying to figure out why, What do you mean? Were they? You've learned that the CIA was protecting Hunter Biden while Donald Trump was president?
Well, no, while his father was vice president, while his father was, while Donald Trump was president, we only know one instance, and this is this warning off of the prosecutors in Delaware from interviewing Kevin Morris, Hunter Biden's benefactor who was protecting him. And now the reason that the investigators wanted to interview Kevin Morris, one big reason, was because they suspected that there had been campaign finance violations over all this money that was being paid to Hunter Biden that was really having the effect of protecting Joe Biden's presidential campaign so that these scandals didn't blow up. Donald Trump was just convicted over that similar crime, supposed, in New York. So the FBI was looking at that and, basically Kevin Morris was off limits, and the prosecutors, according to these IRS whistleblowers, were very negative about pursuing that line of inquiry. And so that investigation into Kevin Morris never went anywhere.
So back for a second to Smirnov. So Smirnov's information about the alleged $10 million bribes that the head of Burisma paid Hunter Biden and Joe Biden, he's been sitting in jail since February because the FBI is alleging that their longtime, well-paid informant was lying to them about this. Now, where does this come from? I mean, he's not the only person who's making allegations about the Bidens and Burisma to the tune of many millions of dollars. I'm not sure. I don't think that this was the first time that people had alleged that they got the bribes. So I might be confusing this with the Chinese energy company that we'll talk about in a second. That gave them millions of dollars. I think they gave them up front like $5 million or something like that. So I might be confusing the two. Is he the only one who claimed that they got $10 million in bribes?
He's the only one who's used the word bribes. Obviously, the Chinese money that went to Hunter, I think $12 million or so from that Chinese energy company, CEFC. They weren't paying Hunter for his business acumen. They were paying him for the favor of his very powerful father. So whether you call that a bribe or not, but certainly Smirnov is the only one who's used that word bribe. Now, Smirnov, a cynic would say that Smirnov was arrested and charged and exposed all his contacts with Russians, high-level Russians, who he was spying on, have been exposed, putting him in grave danger. A cynic would say it's because he and his bribery allegations became a political embarrassment after the Republicans were told by an FBI whistleblower about the existence of these Smirnov claims, and that they were sent to David Weiss's office in Delaware, and that he buried them, he hid them. And so the Republicans in Congress, particularly Senator Chuck Grassley, made a big deal of this and forced the FBI to show them this FBI report that had been hidden, that Smirnov had made these allegations. And then the FBI was very secretive about it, was redacting everything, the FBI director, Chris Wray, had to be threatened with contempt of Congress before he even eked out a tiny little bit of information. And finally, Chuck Grassley had enough. He sniffed that this was a corrupt, dirty deal. So he just released a redacted version of that FBI document. It's called an FD 1023, I think, FD 1023. And that was basically the record of interview of Smirnov in which these allegations of the bribery were made. But, Grassley and the Republicans were at pains to say, as we were, the journalists were, that these are uncorroborated allegations. They're made by this corrupt Ukrainian energy mogul and don't necessarily, they need to be investigated. But, that was exactly why they were sent to Delaware, where David Weiss was supposed to have them investigated. His investigators were never shown them. So, these bribery allegations could be true and they could not be true. But for some reason, David Weiss didn't want to find out if they were true or not. He hid them, which was most peculiar and most wrong. And the IRS whistleblowers were very upset about it when they found out. So fast forward, David Weiss has been embarrassed because the IRS whistleblowers have divulged that he was trying to let Hunter Biden off with no charges. Hunter wouldn't have had to plead guilty to anything. And so David Weiss then quickly got his people to cobble together this sweetheart plea deal for Hunter, where he would plead guilty to a couple of misdemeanors, tax misdemeanors, and then there'd be a diversion agreement for the gun problem, and it would all go away. No jail time. He'd just have to say he'd be a good boy and get a slap on the wrist. But unfortunately for them, it was so hastily put together in a panic after the IRS whistleblowers had thrown everyone into turmoil. And then they hit an honest judge in Delaware, believe it or not, Judge Mary Ellen Noreika. And she just smelled a rat. And she just said, I don't like this. She asked a few more questions. And the new prosecutors who'd been brought into the case after the whistleblowers had blown everything up, they're sort of straightforward prosecutors. They're not part of this protection racket. And they had to answer honestly her question, which is, are you intending that Hunter Biden get blanket immunity for any other alleged crimes? And the honest prosecutors had to say, no, we're not giving him blanket immunity. And then Hunter's lawyers were furious about this. This all played out in court last July in Delaware. They were furious because they had managed to eke out this incredibly beneficial plea deal for their client. And now the biggest prize of it all was this immunity from any future prosecutions. And so they blew the whole thing up in court. And so the plea deal collapsed.
So the plea deal was canceled. But can I just interrupt you for a second? Because we're not going to have time. And it's important, but it's not essential that everybody understands all of the details. But I mean, the thing that comes out very clearly in your book, and that comes out in all of the other information, the Smirnov indictment, and we can get in. I'd love to talk for just a couple of minutes about Gal Luft and the case that they built against him, and why, and the timeline for announcing his indictment. Just around a year ago, I think. When did they? It was in the end of 2023. I think they did it. And no, when was it? It was
November, I think, 2023. They indicted him, and
2022 because 2023 was already the war. So a year before the war.
Sorry, you're right.
No, it's before October 7th and after October 7th.
That's right.
But so the thing that comes across very strongly in what you've been working on for this whole time since the laptop story is just how incredibly the mountain of allegations of extraordinary corruption by Hunter Biden, by Trump's brother, by Biden's brother Jim Biden, and the clear interaction between President Biden, his son, and his brother, with everything relating to the millions of dollars that they're receiving for influence peddling with foreign governments, with Burisma being the first one that sort of blew up into the public sphere, and it's the one that now has netted Smirnov in jail, and Gal Luft, another Israeli, is in hiding. But it's a characteristic of this man, of this and his family, that he was using, at least throughout his vice presidency, he or his relatives were using his position as the vice president of the United States, and a very powerful one, who had a lot of things that he was responsible, or he was responsible for U.S. policy towards Ukraine and towards China. He was a very powerful vice president. in that sense. He had a lot of things that he was in charge of. And that they were using his position as a means of raking in millions and millions of dollars from people who had very close ties to the Chinese government, to the Chinese president, Xi, and to the Ukrainians. And I think Romania was another country, and there were other countries as well, Kazakhstan. It's an extraordinary tale that I don't think that we've ever seen anything like in the history of the United States. And how much do you think that all of these dealings by Hunter, by Jim Biden, and the revealed connections between Joe Biden himself and their business partners while they're doing business with them, these foreign business partners, including Chinese, how much do you think that colors his policy making, the decisions that he makes in office, if you had to assess? And you've been looking at this closer than almost anybody other than, the House investigators.
Look, you can't tell for sure because you can't see inside his mind or his heart, but this is not just a powerful man whose family has grifted off him. He is the ringleader of the grift. He's been doing this since his earliest days in that peculiar state of Delaware. He's been influence peddling and using his family while he posed all his life as modest Joe, the poorest man in Congress. He lived a lavish lifestyle. I mean, he lives in the most exclusive enclave in Delaware. He has lived always in DuPont mansions that he's bought. He always aspired to the wealth of the DuPonts, who were this aristocratic family that loomed large over Delaware. He built his own, estate, lakefront estate, with bespoke builders imported in from Philadelphia with wood-paneled walls. And, the way he lives, his clothes, his lifestyle, his penchant for fast cars and beach houses, and his entire family. And because he wasn't earning the money himself into his bank account, he deputized his brother and then his son, Hunter, to go and be the bag man. And Hunter was smarter than his brother. So Hunter was good at this and charming, very charming. And so Hunter wanted to be an artist or a writer, and instead he had to go to work in the family business. His father made him go and earn money to support the rest of the family. And you know this from the laptop, where Hunter complains bitterly about having supported the family for the last 30 years. I mean, he had to pay off not just his own expensive college bills, but those of his brother. The bills that Hunter Biden paid, Joe Biden didn't have to pay. There's also evidence from the laptop that Hunter Biden paid bills for his father, just regular household bills, maintenance of the estate, building a brick wall, replacing air conditioning, painting shutters. There's just a little taste of that. Also, there's some, evidence that the Republicans have dredged up of money going from, say a Chinese deal into the brother's bank account and then being taken out by the brother's wife in cash and then deposited somewhere else. And then it eventually makes its way to Joe Biden into one of his accounts, but it's written on the check is loan repayment. And then, when the Republicans brought that out, Joe Biden and his protectors all say, oh, well, that was a loan. He loves his brother, et cetera, and you can't prove otherwise. And it's interesting, the evolution of the language that's been used by Joe Biden's campaign and the White House as more and more revelations have come out. Initially, before the 2020 election, Joe Biden swore blind, I know nothing about my son's overseas business dealings. Then after the laptop, it was, I wasn't involved, or he wasn't, Joe Biden was not involved in business with his son. And then the latest iteration was, didn't profit from business with his son. So, he's crab walked away from his initial lie. And there's evidence, and he's admitted to some of it, the White House has, that he met with at least a dozen of Hunter Biden's overseas business partners in person. He met one in China after he flew Hunter on Air Force Two when he was vice president to Beijing, where he had all these high-level meetings with Xi Jinping. And then he invited them to his home in the vice presidential official residence in Washington, D.C. for breakfast. A couple of different groups, Mexicans, who was the other guy? He was from Romania. And then he also went to, we know of 2 dinners at a restaurant in Georgetown in Washington, D.C. called Cafe Milano in a private room. Hunter Biden organized dinners for his clients from, in one case, it was Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan. They came to this private room, and Joe Biden, then the vice president, came to dinner, sat down and had dinner with them. Now, we broke that story, and the paper was, we were suppressed. We were censored by big tech. After the 2020 election, we fleshed out the story of Joe Biden meeting with Hunter's Ukrainian paymaster from Burisma, this Ukrainian energy company, and we traced it to this dinner at Cafe Milano in April of 2015, where Joe met the Ukrainians and the Russians and Kazakhstanis.
While he was vice president of the United States.
While he was vice president. And his campaign lied and said there was no such meeting before the election. After the election, refused to respond to us, but the Washington Post decided to do a fact check of my story, so convinced were they that it was wrong. And the White House admitted, well, yes, Joe Biden did go to that dinner, but not for any nefarious purpose, and he was only there very briefly. But we knew from people at the dinner that Joe Biden was there the entire time and did speak to everyone there, Hunter Biden's clients. So, it's quite, the extent of the corruption is enormous, and it's catalogued partly in the laptop, but much more so in other pieces of information that corroborate what was on the laptop. For instance, Hunter Biden's former business partner, Tony Bobulinski, he's handed over all the contents of his devices with encrypted apps. Then you've got the IRS whistleblowers, and they have the iCloud data, all Hunter Biden's encrypted conversations with the Chinese, the money changing hands, threatening the Chinese, if you don't give me this money, my father is sitting next to me, and with all the people that he knows will make your life a misery. A few days after that, $4 million pops into his bank account. But none of that, unfortunately, will be prosecuted because, as I told you, that investigation in Delaware that went on for 5 years, those investigators who've become whistleblowers were prevented from following any of the natural investigative trails that would lead to Joe Biden. And that included, they weren't allowed to get out a search warrant for a cottage on Joe Biden's estate where Hunter had been living. They weren't allowed to geolocate phones to see if Hunter Biden was telling the truth when he said, I'm sitting next to my father, when he sent that shakedown message to his Chinese partners. When the investigators wanted to search a storage locker of Hunter's, the prosecutors tipped off his legal team. So I think, though, that this tax fraud case in this trial that's going to come up in September in California, just a few weeks before the election, if it's allowed to go ahead and there's not a plea deal beforehand, which I'm assuming there'll be a lot of pressure to do, there will be a lot of information there that I think will be at least politically damaging and quite revealing about Joe Biden's involvement in his son's business dealings. I mean, it's a narrow range of charges because the crucial years, the Burisma years, 2014 and 15, the statute of limitations was allowed to lapse by David Weiss. And that has protected Joe Biden enormously because it means that his forcing the firing of the prosecutor general in Ukraine does not come into it. but it's still evidence in that case. So it will be discussed, it will be brought up, even though no one could be charged over it.
So here's another question. I guess, so we can go to Gal Luft, and I think it works as well with the Smirnov case. Gal Luft came forward the month before Joe Biden announced that he was running for presidency, and he met with prosecutors from the Southern District in New York and from the FBI at the U.S. Embassy, I think it was in Brussels, and he gave them the entire story of the Bidens and the Chinese energy fund company, the CEFC energy conglomerate of China that paid the Bidens millions of dollars, that was later exposed by the laptop. And he never heard from him again. And according to him, he came forward because he was worried that Biden was going to become the Democratic nominee. And he thought if he told the FBI that maybe they would do something to prevent him from running. And in the event, rather than ever hearing from them again or following up on the allegations that I assume he gave some documentation of, they never spoke to him again. And the next he heard from them was when they issued an arrest warrant against him, and he was arrested, or he didn't know they issued when he was arrested at a Cyprus airport on his way back to Israel, and they were acting on an American arrest warrant, an Interpol arrest warrant that had been hidden from Israel, where Gal had been living for many years beforehand, and he was put in jail in Cyprus on gun running charges, on gun selling charges, and then he was let out on bail and he fled, and since then he's been in hiding. And so they're coming after him on these with this indictment. They're coming after Smirnov, saying that he lied to the FBI, although I don't think anybody's ever proven that he lied, just they're claiming that he lied. And at the same time, Hunter Biden, after all of these years, finally got convicted of a crime of lying on a federal declaration that he wasn't using drugs when he bought a gun in Delaware. That took years, but there's no real investigation of Biden. The FBI that goes after Trump and sends in agents to Mar-a-Lago to search the former president's house. They tip off the Bidens about search warrants, and they don't want to pursue any leads. I mean, if this is it says one thing about the FBI, but it also says something about vindictiveness, I think, on the part of Biden's loyalists at a minimum, that it's not just that they're letting him off, but they're going after anybody who points a finger at him with extraordinary venom and like this stubbornness, this obsession that they have to go after anybody who gives any information that could be considered credible against Biden.
Yeah, you summarized it very well. I mean, it's staggering, the incuriosity of the FBI with all the allegations and all the evidence that has flooded into them for so many years about Joe Biden's corruption. And Gal Luft brought to them evidence of the money that was going to Jim Biden, Joe Biden's brother, and Hunter Biden from CEFC. He also brought to them this very sinister and frightening allegation, which was that the Southern District of New York had a mole in their ranks. The FBI had a mole in their ranks because Gal Luft knew that the Chinese had been tipped off that there was an indictment with the names of several of their people on it, and they escaped. Patrick Ho went to Hong Kong, and Chairman Yi ended up fleeing. And Hunter Biden, according to Gal Luft, that was his FBI mole. And so these were they were serious allegations. Gal Luft was a serious man. He had the access. They heard him out. And what do? They do nothing with those allegations. And then they arrest Gal Luft, and they arrest him just around the time of the midterm elections, when the Republicans are about to take over the House and start investigating the Bidens.
Okay, that's right. He was arrested in October of 2022, just before the Republicans were set to take back the House and be able to issue subpoenas. And
Yeah.
that and he hasn't been able to testify as a result, which is really amazing. And I guess that for me, and I was reading your book, the details about Hunter Biden's lifestyle, his incredibly enormous use of drugs. I mean, just unbelievable, the tens of thousands of dollars he pists away in order to, drug rush, millions of dollars on his drug habit, and his lavish lifestyle, and the whoring, and I mean the opulence, the way that he just spent thousands and thousands of dollars on these fancy suits. They're so fancy that I never even heard of the designers, and this is the president's son, and there doesn't seem to be. There's an obvious absence of any concern for the United States of America in all of these things. So his father is vice president of the United States. He's former vice president of the United States. He's running for president of the United States, and then he's president of the United States. And there's nowhere in this whole thing, there's always concern for how much money I'm going to make, how much money the family is going to rake in. Where's my piece of the action? What's my cut? Am I going to be paid up front? Do I have to wait? What's going on here? But you never hear anybody. And that was what was so amazing about Tony Bobulinski, is that he seemed to be the first person to enter that entire universe, this former naval officer, the first person who seemed to wonder, well, what does all of this mean for the United States? I mean, it was so stark, his presence in that book, that you just said, isn't that supposed to be Joe Biden's voice? I mean, isn't that supposed to be Hunter Biden's voice? Your father is vice president. Isn't the main thing supposed to be service? Isn't the main thing supposed to be country? And the only person who ever raised the issue of how does this impact American national security, that you're making millions of dollars with this Chinese energy consortium that is inextricably linked from the Chinese Communist Party and from the regime of China. How does that implicate American interests? Nobody ever asked that question. That, to me, was the most stunning aspect of the whole story.
Yes, you're so right. And Tony Bobulinski is a patriot, and he grew increasingly disturbed, and he's now a real thorn in the Biden side, and he's determined to ensure that they face the music. And, he knew about the Chinese angle, and he knew that they were being used. And Joe Biden, I can only speculate, but we do know that when Joe Biden came to office, he unwound a lot of the tough policies that Donald Trump had enacted against China, including, strangely, there was an FBI program to investigate the sort of infiltration of the CCP into the universities. He unwound that. For what reason? I mean, they had scalps. They'd found spies. The only reason you can see is to curry favor with China. Joe Biden is, I think, he has agency, but he also has been a puppet of a particular faction of the CIA for, nigh on half a century. And so he does and has always, I don't really know. I mean, I think it's been described to me as the Atlanticist faction, which is ultra paranoid about Russia, not so worried about China, and has this pipe dream of cutting Europe off from Russian gas, Russian energy supplies, and is a sort of a rogue faction that doesn't care about Israel. There is also an Israel faction, but I don't think they have as much power. Look, this is the way. I'm not an expert on the factions in the blob. We're talking about the State Department, the CIA, and the Pentagon. But there's certainly, I am an expert on Joe Biden and how he's been protected by the blob all his life, all his career, and the reason for that is obvious, because when they want him to, he'll be a warmonger. He's been a warmonger. He wanted the them to bomb Yugoslavia at one point. He was, as the powerful Senate Foreign Relations chairman in the Senate during the Clinton years, he was the one who persuaded a reluctant Democratic Party and Bill Clinton to allow China into the WTO in 2000, I think it was 2000, 2001. And that was something Republicans wanted, but Democrats didn't. But that was something that was beneficial to China, which I believe had its claws into young Senator Joe Biden from an early age. He went to China to a confab as one of the first American senators to go there, went to the equivalent of Martha's Vineyard for a weekend, met all the top CCP people, and came back and was so extravagant in his praise for China that the Weekly Standard actually ran a cover saying what a fool he was and what a kind of useful idiot he was for the Chinese. And I think he's remained like that all the time. And I think when President Xi saw him coming, he was manna from heaven. And in China, you don't pay the bribes to the powerful official, you pay them to the princelings, which is their sons and daughters. And Hunter Biden arriving on Air Force Two with his powerful vice president father in December of 2013 to meet President Xi, and for Joe Biden to meet the Chinese business partner that was going to funnel Hunter into this lucrative deal. That was a message to the Chinese. They knew as soon as they saw Hunter Biden walk off Air Force Two that this was American power come to do private business.
There's a sense that Biden wasn't even the vice president. He was the tribal leader, and he was the chief. He was the chief, and his son was coming as the son of the chief to come do business. I mean, that was the sense. There's just like no America there. There's just no America.
Well, Obama had outsourced his power, his foreign relations power, to Joe Biden, and maybe that was the deal that allowed Obama to become president, because the blob would only have allowed this foreign policy naif, which Obama was, to become president if he had this old hand, their puppet, Joe Biden, running the rest of the world.
That's a pretty dark view of the American electoral process, I guess. But, that there are people behind the scenes who get to decide who gets to be president and in what conditions. Maybe I'm naive. I know I'm not, but I mean, that's something you have to swallow hard when you hear it. But look, here we are in Israel and America and its role in this war. And we just lost 8 soldiers today in an explosion. They were apparently hit in their armed personnel carrier by an IED or an anti-tank missile. And, there's a lot of questions. Why were they doing it the way they are? Why are we going so slowly? Why are we going in? And the reason is always America, America, America. The Biden administration is putting enormous pressure on Israel to roll back, to walk away, to end the war without victory, leave Hamas in power, which means lose the war. And it just feels like there's so many other things going on that we don't know about that are guiding an American policy, which is completely antithetical to American strategic interests. I mean, you allow a jihadist army to win a war, you're placing your own country in danger because you have them now crossing the southern border freely, at will. So it's an amazing thing, this willful blindness to the nature of the threat that the United States is expanding. And, when rational calculations don't seem to explain what's happening, you start to wonder what else could be at play. And when you see the entire story of the Biden family corruption, the influence peddling, and the way that so many outside considerations play into the decision-making of the President of the United States, it sort of makes you wonder. It certainly is something that we should be wondering about, I think, especially given, the fact that 2 Israeli nationals are being hounded by this administration as well. How do you see that?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's definite similarities between Gal Luft and Smirnov. Gal Luft was an officer is in the reserve still in the IDF, and Smirnov. There's some indication from the indictment that Smirnov, in his early 20s, when he was still living in Israel, that he was working for the Israeli government as a spy or as an informant. And so I mean, you know, it just makes you wonder if there's some sort of antagonistic sort of spy versus spy situation going on here. And then you have to add into that the wrinkle of the appeasement of Iran, unwinding the Trump administration's, demolishment of the Iran deal, trying to resuscitate that. And you find out that Antony Blinken's childhood friend from Paris, a guy called Rob Malley, who I'm sure you're aware of, who was in charge of, he was the Iran envoy. He's now on suspension without pay from the State Department while the FBI investigates him for improper handling of classified material. And meanwhile, there are people that he's installed, including in the Pentagon, who are still there working to this day. Now, what's that all about? Can I interrupt you
for a second? When we talk about Antony Blinken, he appears once in your book, I think, where he has a conversation with Hunter Biden, and when he's the Deputy Secretary of State under John Kerry, and there's, and I'm trying to remember exactly what the passage was about, whether it was about Ukraine or it was about China, but it was fairly Ukraine. It was fairly clear from the narrative that Tony Blinken was well aware of what Hunter Biden was doing with Ukraine, and that he was very, very close with the Biden family. He was a Biden family friend, not just the vice president's foreign policy guy who was placed in the State Department as well because of his close ties with the vice president. And you kind of wonder, what his relationship. I mean, you had all of these Biden family associates who were engaged in the actual businesses with them. And, how much do you think Tony Blinken was really aware of, involved in at some level, probably not monetary, but at some level with what was happening with the Ukrainians and the Chinese and the Romanians and the Kazakhstanis?
Well, in the next book, I have a lot more about Antony Blinken because we've discovered a lot more about his involvement. Now, Antony Blinken was a junior staffer for Joe Biden in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So that's how far back they go. He owes his entire career and the fact that he's Secretary of State to Joe Biden. He hitched his wagon to Joe during the Trump years. He marked time in the Penn Biden Center at University of Pennsylvania. And interestingly, in October of 2020, when the New York Post republished the first story from the laptop showing that Joe Biden, an email showing that one of Hunter Biden's Ukrainian paymasters had thanked him for the meeting with Joe in Washington, D.C. when Joe was vice president, which was denied. Now, that story sent a shockwave through the Biden campaign. And we know that because we've got testimony from a former CIA acting director, a guy called Mike Morrell. He says that after our story came out, he got a phone call from Antony Blinken, who was a senior advisor to the Biden campaign, soon to become Secretary of State when Biden won. And Antony Blinken asked him about the story and put into his mind, instigated this guy, Mike Morrell, to write a dishonest letter claiming that the laptop and therefore our stories were Russian disinformation.
Right.
And
that's right.
Mike Morrell, he was behind it. And he got 50 other, mostly former CIA people, including 5 former directors of the CIA, acting directors, people like John Brennan and other, senior intelligence people like James Clapper, Leon Panetta. And they all signed this letter without knowing anything about the laptop, without seeing it. It was a lie. It was itself a domestic disinformation program. And Mike Morell made no secret of the fact that he'd been asked to do this by the campaign, and it was to give Joe Biden a talking point to push back on Donald Trump at his debate in a few days' time, the final presidential debate, at which Donald Trump was sure to ask about the laptop. And sure enough, Donald Trump brought up the laptop, and what does Joe Biden say? He references
51.
the 50, and then he says it's a Russian plant, it's a bunch of garbage. And it worked for him. He got off, and, we've had polls showing that if the American people had known about what was on the laptop, known about our stories that were being censored, then enough of them in that very narrow election that was won by Joe Biden by 45,000 votes in, I think, 5 states, enough Biden voters would have changed their vote to change the outcome. I mean, we'll never know, but Antony Blinken played a significant role, and he was rewarded with the Secretary of State position. And he's really running foreign policy.
Yeah, he really is. Right. Well, I think we probably should leave it at that. But I think that what you really provide, because, people who are centered on Israel probably feel like this doesn't have as much relevance for what we're seeing on a policy level with the Biden administration being extremely hostile to Israel and hostile to the concept of Israeli victory in this war than it does to American domestic politics and to bilateral relations with the countries that were involved with his foreign dealings. But I think, for me, the story, the incredible depth of the corruption of this family and the lack of concern for how what they're doing to rake in the millions is going to, impact the United States of America. I mean, for me, it's just this callous narcissism and vindictiveness towards people who call them out, as you can see with Smirnov and with Luft, and Trump, who was just, he was being, he just was convicted for nothing that I could understand anyway. And I think it speaks to the nature of the president just as much as dementia does, and certainly to the people who are in his inner circle who have been protecting him all these years. So I think it's a very important story for everybody who's trying to understand the nature of American policy to really understand. Any final thoughts before I sign off?
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I think what it does reveal is the kind of malevolence at the heart of, and the venality of Joe Biden and the dysfunctionality of his family.
Why malevolence, and why malevolence specifically? I feel that too, but maybe you can spell it out a little bit more clearly.
Because anybody who dares cross the Biden family gets not just dealt with, but destroyed. And he has no compunction about using all the power available to him. And he's done that. I mean, in his home state of Delaware, people are terrified of him. We saw that. Amazing that jury finally did find Hunter guilty, but we saw that with the computer repair shop guy. He was afraid he was going to be killed. We saw that with the gun shop owner who said his quote to the FBI was he and his employees were scared to death that the Bidens would be angry with them. So this is the way he's ruled, and now he's in Washington, and it's this sort of small-time crook mentality where you punch someone on the nose, you destroy them if they cross you, and that's what's happened to Smirnov and Luft. Smirnov, he has glaucoma. They're not allowing him to have the eyesight-saving eye drops, pain-relieving, but also saving his eyesight drops. He needs an operation. They've just thrown him in jail and left him to languish. It's the same as what they've done with the January 6th rioters. I mean, most of them are not rioters. They were just protesters, people who wandered in through an open door, going to jail for 15 years. There's no mercy. There's no kindness. And you just see the way Joe Biden speaks about his opponents, MAGA, ultra MAGA. His voice contorts with hatred. You saw in that TikTok video where he's talking about Israel. I mean, he is vindictive and malevolent, and that goes against the mythology that he's built up as, this pleasant Uncle Joe guy, and that he presented to the American people in 2020 when he said he would unite the country, and he's done the opposite. So I think that looking at his dysfunctional family and their venality, their greed, it gives you an insight into who he is. I feel sorry for Hunter Biden, and I'm not surprised he turned out the way he did, with a father who is obsessed about nothing but power.
You're right. I mean, there's something very 1980s about him, that he just has, he's so messed up. He's such a messed up person. And I don't feel bad for him. He's a pathetic creature, but I think he's also malevolent and vindictive. So I don't really know. I mean, he goes after people, and while he's high on crack, I mean, it's just an unbelievable story. I would have all of you read The Laptop from Hell if you haven't yet. It's a page turner, and I look forward to reading the next one coming out. I think it's a very important tale as well to tell, because this is a huge story. It's one thing when it's a Delaware senator, no matter how powerful. It's another thing when it's the vice president of the United States. And it's even another thing when it's the president. And, you never imagined you'd live to see a day like this, but you have. And I have a feeling that this is bleeding into all kinds of different places. And yes, the same vindictiveness is certainly at play in the way that he's treating Israel right now. So, Miranda, I'm so thankful for you to joining me on the show today. And everybody, you just have to pay attention to what's going on domestically with the Biden administration's Crime Inc. and look into it. These things are important. They're all connected one to the other. I'm fairly certain, and not in a conspiratorial way, just in the measure of a man's character. Anyway, thank you so much, Miranda, and we'll see you guys again on Monday, I think. So take care and have the rest of your weekend. Have a good rest of your weekend if you don't live in Israel, and have a good beginning of our work week tomorrow. Take care.
Yes, and good luck. All right, and I hope things go better for you. I'm very sorry to hear about those soldiers.
Yeah, it's terrible. You're right. It should go better for all of us. And Miranda, I'm going to have you back on when your next book comes out. I know you're going to be really, really busy with interviews, but you're going to have to make time for this little show here.
I'd love to.
Okay, take care, guys, all of you, and see you soon.